Okay, welcome everyone to our roundtable on acting pedagogy, which, as you know, is part of the 2020 CATR SQET conference titled Partition Ensemble. And indeed, how fitting that we are all apart and yet together here in this virtual gathering. I want to acknowledge that I myself am joining you from Abbotsford, BC, which is the unceded territory of the Stolo Nation. And as we move into kind of gathering, even as much as it is in virtual space, I think as ever, it's key to remember what are the places that are supporting us to do our work and find a way to continue to think and live and try to be better acting teachers during this time. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. My co-organizer of this session is Art Babayants, and I'll open it up to him, and then kind of we can go around again in this virtual space, whoever would like, to briefly introduce yourselves. As we know, and again, this is more for our audience who might be checking into this through the asynchronous sessions. We have already shared submissions through our Google Drive, which was a wonderful opportunity to hear everybody's experiential framework and perspectives on the larger roundtable call, which, as you know, was around thinking through different partitions, kind of drawing from the conference theme, and those challenges and how we're trying to intervene and move forward in our practices to be more inclusive and to create more complexity in our work. And I thank everyone, because I think really we're coming at this from, there's a lot of common ground, but also a lot of different particulars, which I'm looking forward to being able to work through and find out more today. So the forum again today will be that we'll go through briefly. Everybody, please introduce yourselves. Share with us any key thing you'd like to highlight from your submission, if you'd like, or anything even that came across from reading other people's submissions. Again, we're not beholden to that first submission. And I'll just ask you to please keep in mind to keep that to around 2 to 3 minutes or so. From there, we'll move into open questions, moderated by myself and Art, but really, again, open. I'm hoping, you know, once this is flowing, we can just see where it goes and a wrap up. So again, thank you, everyone. And I'll move it over to Art, and then kind of we can hear from everyone.
Hi everyone, bonjour tout le monde. My name is Art Babayants. I'm in Montreal right now, and I've just finished my 2-year term at the University of Regina, where I was teaching acting, dramaturgy, and a whole bunch of other things. I'm the artistic director of Toronto Laboratory Theatre, Le Théâtre Laboratoire de Toronto, and I've been doing all kinds of work. And when I proposed this particular session to Shelley, I was very excited to hear that the issues that I faced in Regina as an acting instructor were very similar and different to some extent from what she was sharing, and I was pleased to see her enthusiasm, and then I was double pleased to see your responses and the extreme variety of approaches and responses to the current situation in terms of acting pedagogy. Just to remind you, my submission was a video because I'm tired of reading. So my submission was a dialogue with Shelley about my research, where I worked with multilingual and monolingual actors who were creating a production. I think Sonia saw some of that work. I'm not sure if Sarah did in Toronto. And I was trying in my submission to give some pedagogical implications based on the research in applied linguistics that I was familiar with when you're working with actors who are performing in their second language or third language or in their non-dominant language, or if you're working with performers who are attempting to perform bilingually or multilingually, which is a common, well, an emerging thread in Canada. That's what my specific submission was. Thank you so much. Should we go to Sarah? I think Sarah, you were next to log in.
Sure. Hello, my name is Sarah Robbins, and I'm about to start my 5th year as a PhD student at U of T Center for Drama, Theater, and Performance Studies. My research looks at the impact of the Me Too movement on actor training in Canada, more particularly Toronto, but specifically the intervention that students of actor training have made through hashtags online and what specific practices have emerged as being especially relevant for maintaining equity and intersectionality in actor training in this country. I've had some experience organizing conferences that deal with looking at developing actor training in this country. I organized the 2019 Foot Conference at U of T on equity and diversity in performing arts. And also I co-organized the inaugural Got Your Back Actor Training Conference that was held at Tarragon Theatre in Toronto in May last year, and helped organize the Canadian Theatre Educators Conference that was organized largely by Neil Silcox and held entirely virtually this year, this past May. So that's a bit about me. Thanks.
Trisha, do you want to go next? I guess we can go by the order of people signing in, just to make it easy. Thank you.
Sure, Shelley, thank you very much. So my name is Trisha Lamie, and I am the program director in theater and performance at the University of Toronto on the Scarborough campus. We are part of a much larger department that tries very desperately to be interdisciplinary in nature. It's a program that I'm very excited about. I'm also excited about being within the department as well. So we have just recently kind of gutted and renovated our program. We used to be theater and performance studies. However, we were more in, the area of Eurocentric theater as opposed to performance studies. So now what we did, we changed so that we are, and we've been doing this for a period of about 5 years, slowly morphing into theater that has to deal with community engagement, social justice, and intercultural performance. And it's very, very exciting. It's very appropriate, I think, for our students, because when I mentioned in the little blurb that I sent in, we have quite possibly the most culturally diverse student body in the world. And it is my hope that we will be able to, as a department and as a program, to meet the needs and recognize who these students are. Unfortunately, up until about a month ago, we have, in theater and performance, there are 3 of us. We're full-time faculty. I am the only woman. As you can see, I'm a white woman. And the other 2 faculty members are wonderful. They are straight white guys. So finally, we have hired a person of color, a woman of color. I hate that term. If somebody can think of another, way of recognizing people and women of color, I'd be really interested in hearing that. But of course, she is hired as a CLTA. And I mean, that in and of itself is, I think, a little bit problematic. I have quite a diverse background myself. I'm not even sure whether I would consider myself at this point in my career, and not for many years, as sort of a theater artist. And I certainly don't see myself, as a teacher. I'm still learning. After I've been at UTSC for the past 18 years, I've taught in many universities all over the country. I still, dealing with pedagogy, I find really fascinating, but I feel very ill-equipped, to be perfectly honest. And as I mentioned again in the written statement that I sent in, that although I try my best to meet the needs of the students, And I often think that I am at least in a position where I'm doing more good than harm. Sometimes I question that because of the assumptions that I have, just because of my background. I've trained in many eclectic approaches. I've studied at the Nova Scotia College of Art and Design. As I said, I've worked in many, many different institutions, theaters. I've worked in theaters as a director, professional actor. Over the years, have developed my own work and my own approach to the creation of, I guess I'll use the word performance since it's a little more encompassing. The work I do is devoted principally to practice-based research. I'm a member, just a recent member of the Walking Artists Network. That's out of the UK, so I'm very interested in exploring walking as an art practice. I have been doing this for many, many years. I am a member of WIA projects, that's Women in Action, here in Toronto, work that is, community engaged and performance or live art, have live art elements as well. And I collaborate with Red Dress Productions. It's a Toronto company that explores community engagement, and I'm very excited to be working with them, and I have been now for very, very many years because of their inclusive nature. Tristan Wiston, one of the co-artistic directors of Red Dress, has often said that he was really happy to be working with Red Dress and to be one of the artistic directors, because the people that we work with, they come from all over, from different socioeconomic backgrounds. They also have, we've been working with the deaf community, we've been working with the non-sighted community. The last piece that we did was with Luminato. It was May I Take Your Hand, and Alex Balmer, who is a blind artist by her own admission. We engaged different members of the community. I live in Cabbagetown, and the company actually is situated in Cabbagetown. So Tristan and Anna Camilleri, the other co-artistic director, chose all of us, I am also a member of the community, to take Alex on different walks in the neighborhood. And I really enjoy doing that kind of work. The people that are involved do not need any specific training or skills, although we do try to provide training and skill sets for them. So I'm going to leave it at that at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Trisha. Conrad, on to you.
Hey. So my name is Conrad Alexandrowicz. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Theater. And I actually I have to read this land acknowledgement. I acknowledge with respect the Lekwungen-speaking peoples on whose traditional territory the University of Victoria stands, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples whose historical relationships with the land continue to this day. Before I start yakking here, by the way, when you get to be my age, you don't know what to say, because it's like, I've been around a long time. I actually was the one in our department who proposed that we include a land acknowledgement before all of our performances. And I'm not sure the timing of this, but I just wanted to note before I start a general intro that the whole issue of land acknowledgement is I think the only thing worse than not doing it, the worst thing than doing it is not doing it, because it's become kind of a thing that we all do, but there aren't necessarily any practical consequences from doing it, right? But anyway, it's really important to do that. And so therefore. So I come from a dance background. I began working as a choreographer in Toronto many years ago now, began doing very theatrical work and moved into making physical theater. And that became more sort of strictly theatrical. And I, for many years, ran a company that I founded called Wild Excursions Performance. So because of my background in dance and physical theater, I became as somebody who was a movement person when it came time to, after I got my MFA in directing at U of A. So that was what I was sort of competitive for, was teaching physical theater, movement to actors. And so I got my position at UVic in 2008 and began writing in peer-reviewed journals shortly after that, mostly issues to do with pedagogy and gender, the construction of gender. And that turned into a book that was just published in February called Acting Queer, Gender Dissonance and the Subversion of Realism, which is all about dealing with gender nonconforming actors. And so the excerpt that I shared with all of you has to do with the partition that we traditionally use between what's called acting and voice and movement. So I make the argument that acting is privileged, that it's called acting as opposed to, for example, text or scene study. I noticed that Stephen talked about the fact that at SFU, which is possibly the most progressive, I don't know, I hope I can say this, it's one of the more progressive actor training programs in the country, English Canada certainly, so that terminology is more specific. We're working on scenes from things that are called plays. But so what I'm talking about here in that excerpt is the way that we privilege text and canonical works over everything else, and that voice and movement tend to become the kind of handmaidens or assistants to the main job, which is acting, which is about text. And there's all kinds of problems associated with that it's disembodied often. It's a very cognitively seated procedure. It tends to feature, canonical texts, which are texts from dominant cultures, which we know all about. In my department, there's been a lot of use of Chekhov and Ibsen, which I don't have any problem with. It's just that there's all kinds of other texts that we could be drawing from. So I'm connecting this construction to a much broader, debate, and that's been going on for years now in all kinds of disciplines about Western culture and our whole sort of conceptual structure, where the mind and the body are radically excluded one from another. And so it's a problem that has to do with acting pedagogy, but it links to a way bigger discussion about how we operate in our whole cultural tradition that goes back thousands of years, actually, to the ancient Greeks. And it has effects on student experience of what it means to be an actor, because these things are compartmentalized. And I think that it's like, there's that line in the Viewpoints book by Anne Bogart and Tina Landau, where they talk about the North American interpretation of Stanislavski. It's like the air we breathe, we don't even notice it. So these structures, these hierarchies are so thoroughly and pervasively established, I think, in most learning environments, that people don't even question them anymore. So I think it's really time that we started at least using different language to describe what we're doing. There, thank you.
Thank you, Conrad. And Stephen, you're up next. Thank you.
Can you hear me? I
Yes.
am unmuted. Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen Hill, and I teach at School for Contemporary Arts, Simon Fraser, on the unceded Coast Salish territory of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish nations. I've been teaching there for about 13 years. I come out of a practice of directing. I had a company for 20 some years, and our work at SFU, or we've tried to kind of, or what I inherited when I came into the program, and what we continue to do, and I think differentiates us locally at any rate, is a focus on devised work and post-dramatic work. So it's been really tricky in trying to figure out how to do that when students really, where that's really often new to students, although there more and more there's devised work being taught in high schools. Post-dramatic work is really quite new to students in thinking and looking beyond drama. And we've we're reevaluating. I mean, it's an ongoing process, obviously, and we're, you know, in this rapidly shifting world, trying to respond to keep up with the changes that are occurring. And the current one we're in right now, or we've been in for some time, the kind of revolution that's happening in theater in Canada, and is we're struggling to keep up. We also have a history of heavy Eurocentric white faculty teaching, you know, even as we've been trying to teach towards students creating their own work, we've been trying to we've had a history of trying to give them experiences, embodied experiences of historical genres, but so often those genres again have been out of the white Anglo tradition. So we're deep in the shit with everybody else, for sure. So one of the things that I've become really interested in, and I wrote a little bit about it in the blurb, is this move, is the kind of current kind of philosophical move in some quarters towards post-humanism, towards something that goes beyond the psychophysical, that is only this relation of human to human somehow. And how can the theater contribute to such a thing? And how are we contributing to kind of humanist traditions of centering the human above all else? And how the theater and film taken from the theater might be doing that. And then I'm really interested in the idea that training does this, that we are participating in a certain kind of subjectivity, not, you know, and so often it seems that we take it as if we are only constructing or responding to an essentialist kind of subject that already exists, rather than the idea that we may be participating in certain kinds of subjectivity. I lately have begun thinking of the idea, you know, coming out of the idea of practice as research, of looking at teaching as research, and how together can we be exploring with students. And it's always a real trick. How much can you give, and how much can you give critique of what you're giving it at the same time that you're giving it? Yeah, that's a little intro.
Thank you, Stephen. Appreciate it. And Sonia, please. You're still muted. There you go. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sonia Norris, and I am currently an assistant professor at California State University, Northridge. And I just first have to say it makes my heart beat faster to see you all, because I know every single one of these people. I know everybody in the boxes on the screen, even though I haven't seen Conrad for many years. I know him, and I know everybody else. And I am completely dislocated. Mm. I can't give you a land acknowledgement. And I was thinking about that, Conrad, before you gave yours. And that is the most overwhelming aspect of my experience in the past 11 months, having moved to America to take up this job, and then have everything go to hell in a handbasket in the world, but specifically in America, even worse than it already was. And we knew it was bad to begin with, but, and I am so destabilized and so alone. And I bring this up not because I need to just unburden my heart to you, but because it is where my heart resides and where I reside, and how my mind is responding to the circumstances plays into what I teach and how I can teach it, most definitely. And I am just so aware of my isolation, my continued isolation, of putting myself into an isolated state by moving to a place where I didn't know anybody, and then going into lockdown. And for what now, 17 weeks or something, I don't see anybody except on this. I see no one since the middle of March, which was easy to do because I didn't have any community in LA when we went into lockdown. So it was very easy to just isolate. But it's been an interesting situation that I have been doing a lot of thinking and teaching in, because I was forced, as many of us were, but to teach, and because the American semester is longer than the Canadian one, I had 9 weeks of teaching online with 3 days of notice. And I teach acting, which does not translate well, if at all, online. Maybe if I was teaching on camera acting, but I am not. And what I teach doesn't translate well at all, because it is a highly physical approach to acting. And so although the foundation is still teaching the elements of Stanislavski and, you know, your basic actor, Western actor training technique that is related to text analysis and all of that, which sure you could do online. What I really teach, what I specialize in, what I have created my identity around as a 30-year career at this point, becoming known for what I do and how I do it, cannot translate online. It cannot. And so I am dislocated from who I am as well, because my identity, for better or worse, even though self-help books would tell us that we are not what we do, the reality is that what I care about and what my entire life is based around and focused on, again, for better or worse, is my work. And I can't do it. And so who am I? And I can't get back to Canada. That's why I'm sitting alone in isolation in an empty condo in Florida, because it's better than being in a 450 square foot empty apartment in LA, is because I'm not allowed to cross the border. And the psychic distress, I never would have thought. I've lived in Paris, I've lived in London, I've traveled the world, I've gone to Africa. It's not like I'm unaccustomed to not being at home, but the psychic distress of knowing that I can't actually keep myself safe or go home to my people, which is why as I sit here and go, I know every single one of you, and you know me. I'm known by you. And for a very long time for some of you, others not as long. But what that does to me is profound, because I'm only in situations where nobody knows me. That's been my existence for the past 11 months. And then online, in constant groups of people that don't know me, and I don't know them. And so I've been doing a lot of thinking about that in relation to not just my own wretched existence right now, but the existence of my students and who I'm teaching. And when we went online, we were teaching in distress. We were teaching in disaster. The students that I teach, many of them were in hugely disastrous situations because of the precarity of their families, because their parents lost their jobs, because they had to go home, because they had to take on an extra job because they could get, like, all of the things that have gone on. And that's who I was facing, was 22 of those distressed faces amidst my own distress, and teaching them acting from a perspective that I don't even agree with. So what am I doing? Why am I bothering? Why are we bothering? That has been an overwhelming, relentless, refrain in my head, is why? As I demand that the show goes on, as I demand that I get up and I get it up for my students, and that I get it up for the production that I was directing that was meant to be in a theater and for a theater company, and suddenly was online. Just the demand to keep going, to keep going, to keep going. What are we doing? And so all of that plays into the more focused conversation that actually you could say, well, has nothing to do with that, Sonia, but of what are we actually teaching? Because even if we're not online, even if it wasn't COVID, all of that, we would still be needing to have this conversation right now around what is going on in our teaching of acting. But to me now, I can't look at one without the other. I don't have any perspective beyond this moment that is all encompassing, that has completely dislocated me, and it has untethered me. And I don't, I wrote down a pedagogy of failure, and I am engaged in a PhD in clown at the University of Toronto, and writing about failure all the time as I fail and fail and fail. And even before COVID, I felt like I was failing for having succeeded in getting the job that I got. And that's not anybody laying that on me, that is my perception. But to have got the job that I got, where I am white and I am teaching in a predominantly Black and Latinx student population, there is every reason for me to question my existence. And it's just something I never have, I didn't discuss with anybody. I just was aware of it, and I kept going, okay, well, I got the job, and I know why I got the job. We know why I got the job, because I had the skills. But I guess what I've been thinking about in relation to our panel is, okay, it's the self-indulgence of, oh my God, am I irrelevant now? Oh, poor me. It's not that. But there is an aspect that needs to be looked at about, there is only a finite amount of time that we have to teach our students, right? There's only so many hours in a day. So if we are going to add in something else, such as what I mentioned in my statement about Black acting methods. So I go to add that in, and unfortunately we never even got the workshop because it was, we had it planned and it was publicized, and then COVID hit, and it was supposed to happen a few days later. So I still don't know what Black acting methods are. And I'm never going to be the person to teach them, but I will continue to look for the ways that I can bring in what I can't teach. But the reality is that then I have to let something else go. So am I willing to let myself go? And I guess that is what I'm looking at right now, as this entire COVID crisis, ongoing, relentless crisis of dislocation, is a process of letting go from me. And therefore I am looking at, should I be letting go of the work that I believe is so valuable? Not because it's not valuable. All of the work, I've always been the one who brings in the alternative styles, the more avant-garde approach to acting, the physical, the clown, the mask training, all of these things. And now I'm looking at, well, maybe none of it's actually, something has to go. So maybe it's time, even if it is important stuff, maybe it's time for it to go. And I don't even want to say it because it's like, shit, this is being recorded. So I don't want anybody to take my job away, but I'm just I don't have any answer to that. But I don't know whether that makes any sense to anybody, but the reality is that we can't keep offering all of the things that are very valid, as well as adding in the other things that we now believe are also valid and need to be caught in our training that have slipped through the cracks, never being considered. So what are we willing to let go? Pedagogy of failure.
Thank you, Sonia, and thank you, everyone. Again, I think there's so much here, right? I think across everybody's different submissions today, kind of the things you're sharing with us today, what I'm hearing a lot of kind of very broadly is that we're all grappling with, right, what is centered in the training we're coming from, right? What are those values we're prioritizing? What then are things we're, again, trying to bring into our practice, right? Because we have those skills, and how being very aware of who are the students, what are they wanting to train toward, what are the other spaces we need to make space for? And sometimes that does mean stepping out of the way to make that space, right? Recognizing what are things that we are able to do and not. And just kind of maybe to help us focus this. And again, in the hopes of generating with each other a space where we can actually kind of gain and help with expertise specifically. One thing I would contend here, of course, there's also the institutional violences that we're all, many of us are part of that privilege, right? I teach at the University of the Fraser Valley. I got an assistant professorship position. That's a certain kind of privilege. My holding this position means others are not, right? And so on, for sure. But perhaps here, kind of just for the purposes of how short our conversation is, allowing us back into our own classrooms, what are the things we can do within the studio, within the fact that we are the figurehead in that space? How do we actually make space? How do we actually show students who we work with that isn't the end all and be all? I know, for example, here, teaching here, as I have in other places at U of T as well, when I taught at Scarborough, where Trisha is, very diverse population here as well. We have a huge international population of students, mostly from the Punjab region, right? Decentering, allowing the first Lecoq exercise to actually be one where they can then, mutter and speak in whatever language they want, right? So right away saying, just because everything else is in English, and you might be negotiating that and the hierarchy of that, in this space, let me really at least attempt to invite you in and give you more agency, for example. That's one of the things I try to do to negotiate that, right? Or recognize for myself that certain conventions, theatrical conventions that I think are given, might not be the case, right? When we're talking about movement, for example, or we're talking the division between movement and voice and acting, that is so Western. These students are coming from being very well versed in folk, in Indian theater and movies. That looks very different. We're having dance in there right away without even having to talk about it. So it's again, being aware that indeed we're coming with a perspective and what that means and how to move past that. So kind of opening this up, I see there's also responses in the chat, which is awesome. So again, turning to this, giving everybody space here to see Art's comment to Sonia. And I think opening it up to an open question here, and I'll invite anyone who'd like to go. So again, kind of turning, which granted is my interest. So again, if it's not your interest, please push against it. Let's go somewhere else. But toward kind of examples in classroom. For example, for me, again, perhaps because I'm less familiar with it, Stephen, what you're talking about, right? The post-humanism, and you'd mentioned eco-ontology in the classroom. I'm personally just super curious, how would that look like in training? How does that look like in the classroom? What are ways that we could do that? And again, opening that up, again, even more broadly to think together, right? What are ways when we're moving toward remote teaching that physicalization or mask necessarily becomes transposed, becomes something else, but what are ways to think that? Or Sarah, you mentioned the Me Too movement, and again, you wrote in your submission about being aware of that, right? How kind of making space for that significant need to awareness and equity and voice and kind of, right, in the classroom. And I'm just curious about how, if anyone would like to start by sharing what those interventions look like in the classroom. And again, perhaps allowing ourselves to position ourselves as someone who is inviting that intervention, but also realizing that for that intervention to really take place, we have to step out, right? We're not necessarily in the position to speak for and from a lot of these positionalities, but I do, perhaps overly optimistically, do believe that still within our privileged position, there is a way to decenter ourselves and make room for the voices in the classroom. So kind of throwing that out there to anyone who'd like to start us off on maybe more exemplars of their practice.
I could go.
Yes, Conrad, thank you.
And before I do that, I now have like this ribbon of faces and I've lost the whole, how do I get back to using the whole screen?
Yeah. So if you go, indeed, as Sarah is pointing, if you go up to the top right, you'll see it should give you, it should say gallery view right now. If you click on it, it should go back to, oh, sorry, it should say, yeah, gallery view. If you click on it, you'll actually go to gallery view.
This is weird.
I don't understand.
Anyway, I don't want to waste our time with my problems here, but Sonia, I just wanted to say my heart goes out to you. I found that incredibly affecting, and probably this has been written about in the chat, but I can't see the chat now. So and there's just so much to address here. I was struck by the incredible difficulty, because I teach mask also, the incredible difficulty having to deal with the issue of whether a mask has a race or not, and how you would get your head around that. And then if somebody had an explicitly African-American mask and they were a white person and they put it on, would they be doing blackface? Like, that's just such a mind-bending problem. But so, you know, as you said, it's difficult enough in the US, given everything that's going on there, given the huge income inequity. And I was struck also by Trisha's contribution, because I teach in it's a very different kind of environment. I mean, we are struggling so hard with how to get more diversity in our classes, in our faculty, and that's a whole other story. But I'm thinking about, you know, Sonia, you're talking about the work you do and how passionate you are about it and how skilled you are at it. And how can you adapt what you do to be able to offer the students the chance to create out of their own experience? Like you know, Stephen does all this devising work. I supervise a lot of devising work. How can you use clown, for example, to address some of these pressing issues in these students' lives? I mean, a lot of what we laugh at is based in, I mean, rage and laughter are very closely related, right? I mean, most stand-up comics are very angry people. Comedy is about rage, right? Focused. So I'm just wondering, how could you adapt what you already do to respond, to give the students a chance to bring their own incredibly troubled experience into the work that they're doing?
Can I respond to that? Yeah. So that is exactly what I do. I teach an awful lot of devising as well, Conrad. Okay. And in showing up at CSUN in the fall, I needed to get to know the student body. I had already been there. That's how they knew about me, was that in 2014 and 2015, I'd been brought in to teach mask workshops with them. So I had an idea of the student body already, but I wanted to get to know more about who they were and what they were bringing to the room that I was unaware of. And so I used a novel as the text for the class, which really confused the students at first, that the entire semester was going to be spent where they had to be reading chapters of the novel. They got it by the end, but they really didn't get it at the beginning as to why that had anything to do with theater and acting. And we went through a process of talking about the themes, and the novel was, I got it from, what do they call it? The freshman novel, which I think this is a terrific idea that other universities might also have, but I hadn't encountered it anywhere, where CSUN chooses a novel, some committee somewhere, that becomes the freshman novel, and anybody can get it for free. You can incorporate it into your courses, and there are a whole bunch of resources that are provided that if you want to access them, that talk about the novel. And the purpose of it is that it becomes a touchstone of common knowledge for any freshman that is in the university in that state of where am I? Oh my God, I don't know anybody. So it's a community building tool, essentially, is this novel. And so I used it to build community with my new student community. And we then went through it in various ways that, don't need to be brought up here probably, but devising ways in terms of pulling forward the themes from it. Oh, and it was also a novel that was about youth who were coming across with what are called coyotes, coming across into America from El Salvador, from Latin American countries. And it was written by a journalist, and it was based on fact, and it had a lot of facts inside the story of it. And so it became how I could broach subjects with these students about their own experience if they wish to talk about it, or about the political situation, which is more distant and therefore in some respects safer to talk about if they have a problem with talking about their personal experience. But it allowed us to deal with themes that are very present in our university. Like, we have a whole Dreamers Society at this university. It's a big issue. The California State University has a public stance that it will not allow ICE officers on the campus. It will not work to identify students who are in precarious immigration situations. So, because that's who our student body is. So it's a very specific world, and one that I needed to become better, more knowledgeable about. And I wanted the students to, if they were interested and able, to talk about it. and for them to give me some information. And so anyways, that's what we used, and it was very successful in terms of bringing forward their stories. And then the ultimate thing was that we created pieces around it, and they all wrote monologues around it that then became ensemble projects that were unbelievably potent and formed community for them in a liberal arts program where they are very dislocated in their individual worlds. And they suddenly had an entire community, and that they still have because they come and visit me in my office with the pals that they made in that class. So that was exactly what you're talking about, I think, Conrad. And it's something that I've done in various ways. I did it at UBCO, where it's another extremely international student body when I was teaching there in 2017, and did the same devising kind of work. There, just one thing that I'll add in case anybody is interested in another method of working to bring forward the student stories and deal with an international student body, was I worked with puppetry, because I'd been in South Africa for a couple of years working on with Handspring Puppet Company, learning puppetry and working in community on these huge community projects that are, anyway, it's a whole other thing. But so I used the work that I had learned with them in order to provide a means of developing work when people did not speak the same language, or when they were not comfortable with speaking English, even though that's what they were at the university they were hoping to do, but they were not comfortable with it. Yet in order to, and it wasn't able to express what they wanted to express. And puppetry is a phenomenal tool, performance tool, teaching tool, expressive tool, because there's the safety of it being there and not me. And yet I am actually what is filtering through to breathe life into this inanimate object. And so it is my animation that actually is being presented. So it's so powerful and so beautiful. And if you work with 3-person puppets, which is what I was teaching them, it demands that there's the ensemble of 3 people. So I would have 3 people who didn't speak the same language, didn't come from the same culture, all animating ensemble the life force of this one being. And we did a lot of discussion around interculturalism, multiculturalism, what are the differences and what is that in performance? And if you all 3 are creating an entity that you are then breathing your life into, what does that create? And there was a lot of rich conversation that went on around that, and performance exploration that they were very, very engaged with through that. So I highly recommend puppetry. It also speaks to what Stephen was talking about, I think, when he was asking about how do you decenter the human and just the human to human engagement that we tend to favor in theater, and how do you bring forward the engagement with the entire world. Well, that is what puppetry is about, is how do you find the animation in the entire world, which relates to the Lecoq work, of course. That's what all of what we did at Lecoq was about, finding the truth of the life force of every element of life. And the human was just one aspect of that, and becomes the vehicle for the life of everything else, to express the life of everything else. So it's super powerful, I find.
Sonia, could I ask a question? And it's actually for everyone too. Because like I was trained with 0 puppetry experience, nothing at all. It wasn't present in my training at all. And I'm not planning to learn it right now because I have other things I'm learning related to Eastern theater practices, even though puppets are very much also present in many Eastern theater practices. But I'm wondering if one of the difficulties in terms of having this conversation is that we all come from really different training schools. And if a conversation is possible when we all go back to what we can do only, rather than learning something new for ourselves and putting what I don't know if Shelley meant that by decentering, putting yourself in an uncomfortable position where you have to learn a completely new technique, a completely new language, both human language or aesthetic language, or shift your framework entirely, because as a teacher, it puts you on a very shaky ground where you don't know how things work. I do remember my experience with studying Kaleri Payat with Philip Zarilli, and the rug was pulled from under my feet, and I realized that all my Stanislavskian training is very, very different. But how do you teach if you're not an expert in a particular area? And how do you decenter yourself and teach at the same time? Is it even possible? And is it possible to rely on the techniques you've never studied before? That's just a general question I would like to throw in. We don't have to answer it. It's just your story made me think about that.
Do you know Jacques Rancière's the ignorant schoolmaster? And that's what you're speaking to, which I really love, which is, if I don't know if everyone knows it, but it's the idea of two kinds of teaching. One that invests in ignorance, where you're investing in the gap between, you have to go home at night and get ahead of what the student knows, that they keep catching up to you, and so in that model you're investing in ignorance. And the other, and he goes through a whole story of a schoolmaster that was teaching something he didn't know in a country that was not his own, that where he said to the students, I'm lost, but don't worry, we're lost, but don't worry, I've been lost before. And as another kind of model of teaching.
Yes, that's exactly the philosophy I was thinking of. And I remember in Regina, one of my discoveries was that there is 16% of the population, indigenous population in that province. And unlike in Toronto, where it's really easy to ignore the indigenous people because of of many reasons, in Regina, it's really hard to, although they've been doing really great for the last 150 years with racism. But I remember having indigenous students in my acting class, and what I had to do, I had to relinquish the power position and say, could you teach us your ways of warming up, your ways of creating a collective space? And we spent weeks learning from my students, and then I had to figure out how to pay them as well, which was a problem. But of course, it wasn't the whole course, but decentering and learning from what students bring to the table was fascinating. Same thing happened in my scene study class, where I chose Thompson Highway's plays as the center of we'll be doing an indigenous playwright and not Shakespeare. And they've never done that before. In fact, the students never heard the name, even though Thompson Highway's father was born in Saskatchewan and Thompson Highway was born in Manitoba. And so it was really interesting to decenter myself, because I didn't study scene study through Thompson Highway. I was taught, we were using Chekhov mostly. So those little possibilities where you make yourself uncomfortable, I think could be the right way to go. I don't know, that's what I've been doing, but that's what I wanted to contribute.
Can I say something as well? Yes, I think that Sonia, just going back to what you were talking about what we're doing or what you were doing specifically and its irrelevance, I don't actually think that what we are doing is irrelevant. I think, you can look at theater, you can look at performance, you can look at the arts in general and say they are in many ways considered to be irrelevant. They're the first things to get cut. I have students who really need to make an A+ because their parents are outraged. It's like, you know, how stupid are you that you've made a B in you know, an acting class? Doesn't everybody make an A+ in acting class? No, people don't. And the idea of, I think, having respect for the arts in general is really, really important. And to know, because when I hear everybody speaking, there's not one person in the round table that I think is doing irrelevant work. And for me, and I'm sure everybody shares this conviction, that what I do, despite what I may say or the questions that I might have about what I am doing, it is the most important thing in my life. And working with those students is one of the most important things in my life. Making sure that they have a positive experience and that I am not, you know, this is difficult. Art, it sort of goes back to what you were just mentioning about giving control to the students and allowing them to sort of engage. And even Stephen, what you were talking about, like the idea of you know, lost, that we don't know where we're going. I've often said to my students in a class when we've been developing work and they've been developing work, it's like, Trish, let's just go back and do it the right way, which is really the familiar way. And I often say to them, we can't go back. The birds ate our breadcrumbs. There's no way for us to go back now. But I do think in the work that I've been doing with students, as I mentioned, because they are come from a very diverse population, that oftentimes allowing them to share aspects of their own culture, their rituals. You know, I have so many Muslim students that I'm teaching, and allowing them to bring their traditions into the class, and that can include, as I said, religious rituals, and it also can include different types of language. And I work, like you do, I think, Art, with a number of different languages, because many of the students in my courses, their predominant language, or they may have like 2 predominant languages now. If they're second generation, they may have English and Farsi, for example, or the international students that do not have English as a first language. Allowing them to create pieces of work that have multiple languages and that don't necessarily have to make literal sense, because it's like they're so focused on exactly people, the audience isn't going to know what we mean. This is not, you know, and I keep saying it doesn't matter. And language, the function of language, as far as I'm concerned, doesn't necessarily have to convey literal meaning. I mean, it's the musicality of different languages is, I think, very, very important. The texture, when we're looking at text or at vocalization, it adds some other texture and element that I think is very theatrical and is very, you know, essential when we are working with students from multiple backgrounds. And so they then get a sense of agency, I think, that who they are, where they're coming from, is respected and that they are heard. So.
Thank you, Trisha. If I could just dovetail on that, actually, and just opening it up to Sarah, not to put you on the spot, but just to share with us, maybe kind of link to what Trisha was just talking about, again, that space for agency. And we've been kind of talking about that, and specifically you working on disability practice and intersectional feminism. Thank you for reminding me in the chat kind of that, the terminology, and just kind of anything you'd like to throw in there. Again, obviously your work already responding to a very contemporary socio-political moment. Again, we keep talking about value in art, and I know for myself, art is very political, and the political possibility of art is key to why I'm very passionate about theater and the aesthetic, which also comes from non-North American, you know, I'm coming from Latin America, the way that theater is being politicized necessarily as an art form, as opposed to this idea of the theater as kind of a museum for a bygone Shakespeare eulogy or something like that. So I think there's a lot of different ways of articulating the possibilities of theater and performance. And so just kind of giving you a spot here to kind of speak to how you're even combining kind of those spaces, and what possibilities you see for that in the acting classroom.
Thank you so much, Shelley. Where to start? So I guess I'll say a little bit about myself to contextualize. I am a graduate of the acting program housed at the University of Toronto, Mississauga and Sheridan College campus, which is sort of a pseudo-conservative style. It is entirely geared toward creating actors, to graduate actors into the industry, but has both an applied and theoretical element. And the reason that I do the research that I do is because of the violence that I witnessed happen in spaces of performance training during my undergrad. That there was just sort of the undeniable presence of sexual harassment on campus that is endemic to programs like this one, but also the violence that happens against Black, Indigenous, people of color, and their sort of absences in these programs altogether. And so I wanted to look at what practices and pedagogies are emerging as working against what we see as the whitewashing of acting training in this country, and also what policies are being developed and enforced to better protect vulnerable students when we see that students in actor training programs are made especially vulnerable because of the nature of the training that we do. And so how I see intersectional feminism and specifically disabled art practices and its interventions in the classroom is that I try and create spaces where constant negotiation and renegotiation of what values are necessary for us to be able to do the work that we want to do. And so the first thing that I ask students in the classroom, and this is something that I learned from Petra Kuppers, she has a great addition for the theater and series theater and disability, which is to ask students, what do you need to be able to do this work, so that I don't presume to know what they need, that I am this holder of knowledge and that they're coming to me to access it, but that everybody who comes at performance brings knowledge with them and that we're all sharing that in the room. And a great example of how this works that I can use from my experience as a TA was in my second year, I was a teaching assistant for Jenny Salisbury at the CDTPS on a course for documentary, devised, and community engaged performance. And in the classroom, we had an undergraduate student who was simultaneously non-gender nor conforming, non-binary, and also a disabled student in that they experienced constant seizures, which meant they made it explicit to us in the classroom what their needs were in terms of if they had an experience with a seizure in the room, which did happen almost every week. And so there was sort of a protocol that we all developed together on how to respond to the students' needs when they arose. And also due to the nature of it being devised performance, their unique identity as being gender non-conforming was not made explicitly present in the work of doing canonical works, but that sort of was something that this person didn't have to make so explicit in their work, if that makes any sense. And I'm welcome to take questions on that, but that's the end of my current thought. Thank you.
I have a question, and I don't know where it goes, but there's something when you say, what does it take to do this work? Because that kind of division gets problematic in my mind of the work. Are we asking students to find ways of, and it's following the idea of decolonizing the classroom or decolonizing practice. And that I just keep coming back to this, and it's my own kind of struggle, but the idea that no technique is neutral. You know, I keep thinking that we keep throwing around the idea of technique as a universal. And that means that there's a universal human, and usually the universal human, we know where that goes. So there's something about is there, you know, that in having to really take a look at techniques that are constructed for particular forms and doing a kind of forensics on that. And not only preparing students of all, you know, of all experiences and backgrounds towards a particular kind of form, that there's something perhaps that we need to challenge further around form itself, the forms, that the theater is really slow in responding, it seems to me.
Yes, I agree 100% with you, Stephen. Thank you so much for offering that. Indeed, community engaged theater practices are not neutral. This happened to be the course that I was assigned to work in, and this was a way that Jenny and I worked together to be able to sort of uphold what we viewed as the main values of performance that for this type of classroom and this type of training, and also in dialogue with the students to say, you know, what are you hoping to get out of this? Because Jenny especially recognizes that students who are coming to performance training sort of already have a sense of who they are as an individual artist and the work that they want to do and the stories that they want to tell. And so it's how we could support them by upholding a renegotiation, a constant renegotiation of the values necessary in the room to be able to do that work. But yes, I do hear you that the forms of performance are not neutral. The canonical Western Anglophone traditions that we adhere to can be especially violent towards certain bodies in this training.
Could I speak up here on this issue? Yeah, I have a problem with this. I really do. I feel like it's my job to be the guide to the students who come into my classrooms having spent half their lives on digital devices where they have become completely disembodied. And I'm a 65-year-old man, and I'm very active and very fit. And I'm more fit than they are. And I want to help them recover their embodiment, which they had when they were little kids. So on the very first day, we talk about how a baby can sit on the floor with an effortlessly erect spine. And I talk about what it means to rediscover that kind of childish re-embodiment. So, you know, I want to try to find a balance between finding out where they're coming from and checking in with them and being sensitive to where they're coming from, and the fact that I have acquired over many decades a lot of skills that I can bring to bear to guide them to a greater kind of self-realization. So, you know, I'm not prepared to abdicate my role as a teacher, even though, as Art was talking about, and part of I'm working on a co-edited volume about theater education and climate change right now. And what's emerging from what I've written for the book and what other people are writing is that we all have to learn a whole new slew of things to teach. And I think that's really important. And I made a note of that Liebembuk book, because that sounds like something I should read. So at the same time that I want to be able to destabilize my position as an instructor, because I'm learning new things to teach, which I had to do at UVic, by the way. I had to learn how to teach mask at UVic, having only hadn't done mask before as a performer. But at the same time, my students need me to give them tools. And that's my job. It's my job to give them tools that they can use for their own purposes, to become better citizens, to become more embodied, to become more, to have a voice, you know, to find their sense that they have a right to expression. So, you know, I have to, just as sort of a cautionary note here, that's where I stand on that issue.
Can I respond to that? And I'm another old guy, so, but only that you just, in some way it sounded like you dismissed the tools that they have. that they're coming in with a whole lot of, you know, and I like to go to, Donna Haraway talked, and I think it's really important right now to think, you know, and Sonia, you were talking about the problem of having to teach with these devices. But, you know, Donna Haraway, I think, has a really good take on it, is that they're not, that it's not mediation, that tools are not mediation. She says that they're organs, that they're full partners, that we're cyborgs in all of this, and there's an evolution going on, and we've got to get on board the evolution. You know, and Merleau-Ponty said something about enfolded flesh, that we are expansive. And how do we do that and so embodied, but our bodies are not. I think that in some way is a romantic view of an old view, but that our bodies are also becoming a part of an evolution that includes all of these technologies.
Could I say something as well, just to continue on that conversation a little bit? Yeah. Thank you, Stephen. And I really love Donna Haraway as well. And I'm always very interested when we are teaching students, like my students, when they come, when they enter the program, they know, they've very rarely been to any kind of theater at all. They may have seen a Murphy's production. They aren't interested in theater for the most part, and there's nothing wrong with that. Many of them want to become or think that perhaps they could become famous TV or film actors. So that's the only model that they actually, have. Which isn't really particularly helpful, because when you're talking about, you know, Donna Haraway, or I know you mentioned Kimberly Crenshaw and critical, you know, her ideas about critical race theory. To me, it's very important that the students bring, yes, they have lots of, I think, specific and interesting and valuable ideas that we need to listen to. And that we need, I'll just speak for myself, that I feel that I need to incorporate into the classroom as much as I can. But certain things, no, I'm not particularly interested in incorporating them into the classroom. No matter what anybody thinks about them, you know, their ideas about improv. And as I mentioned in my statement, most of them initially only want to do like 3 drunks at a bus stop kind of improv. And I find that it really intimidates me, and I'm really interested in using theater or performance as a way of connecting them and helping them connect to a much larger world that is out there, so that, you know, when students are doing work, if, you know, perhaps if they're looking at, say, classical Indian dance, and that is their background, then perhaps what I would suggest is that they look at the work of Gitari Spivak, for example, or, you know, bell hooks if they're, you know, a Black student, not necessarily even a Black student. I always find that so exciting. And once, like, theater is the perfect place for us, you know, that interconnection between and among all kinds of other disciplines. And when the students get into, say, 3rd and 4th year, they begin to see the connectivity between the other disciplines that they're studying. And I find that really important and very, very exciting.
Can I dovetail on that too? I mean, yeah. I love where this conversation has gone. And I think, Conrad, I thank you for kind of saying, wait, let's not, you know, throw the baby out with the bathwater. And I can just say for myself, I don't see those as opposite extremes at all. I think we have, again, we've garnered our very position through the skills we know how to teach. And I think part of that, as I wrote in my submission, is actually, for me, it's a lot of applying the rigor that I was trained as a conservatory trained actor at the Atlantic Theater Acting Company in New York, working as a professional actor after that, into these broad liberal BA programs. I think a very part of how I earned my position as a pedagogue is because I can bring that very specific, rigorous skill set that I can train the students in. But I find that, importantly, I guess for myself, a way to do that more ethically is to frame it, is to say, this is where this is coming from. And with each passing, again, I'm a junior at this. I don't have, decades of experience yet, but it's to keep framing it and realizing, oh, what are things that I'm taking for granted that I need to highlight in this framing? Not just, for example, that, oh, Jacques Lecoq is coming from Paris, but even more so, right? What are the conceptions as we've been talking about? How is the body forefronted? Even Sonia, as you were talking, right, the Lecoq, that essence that the human body can attain, it's still coming from a very specific, right, like postmodern Western perspective on the human body as reading, as subject, and so on. So again, not to go into too much philosophical, kind of overview, but I think for me, that's an important thing without compromising the very rigorous skill sets that we're here to train. And I think, again, that are really a part of that, because again, as I believe, the art is still, it's still also a form, and part of my job is to allow students to come in with their voices, with where they want to take the work, but also to teach them the very skills that will help them be able to actually create art as a form and be aware of all those formal details, as well as the limitations of, this is the program, this is what I can teach, but hopefully also liaison you to what's out there. So I just wanted to kind of say that from my perspective, because I know we haven't specifically talked about kind of conservatory or rigor, but I know from the submissions and knowing a lot of you, I think that is also a really important part that informs how we've arrived at these practical courses and how we're doing that work, right? It's both our own artistic background, but that kind of artistic training. And again, maybe just to throw it out there too, I think interestingly in these broader Canadian university BA programs, some of the wonderful space we have, but sometimes also that slippage of, we're not necessarily, even Trisha, as you said, like even students who think they want to do TV film, but yet they're not going to a film acting studio. They're doing this through this BA program. So again, I think for myself opens a lot of opportunities in the training, but because there's more, but at the same time, it can sometimes mean that like the specifics of that, the rigor in that kind of can get lost, which I think maybe is just another topic on acting pedagogy. Art.
I also wanted to comment on Sarah's approach, which I love in theory, but having taught at the University of Toronto, where I think that approach works probably better, and then moving to a place where, when in your cast, that wasn't my case, I was a dramaturg, but the director approached me and she said, in my cast, out of 12 students, 11 are on antidepressants. They have various issues. They, in addition to socioeconomic issues, similar to Sonia's students, when you realize that it's not one student with seizures, it's literally every single person with major psychological, if not psychiatric issues, plus socioeconomic problems, I wonder how how I don't know if we have an answer for that, but if there is an approach to deal with this, because at some point the instructor needs help and counseling, and so teachers are not machines, and teachers cannot infinitely adapt to the infinite problems that students have. But that's one of the concerns. It's not a question, it's more like I wish we had an answer. And the other problem with students knowing in advance what they need and what they don't need. I always refer to my experience of learning languages. I only speak 4, so I know that when you're learning a language, you think you know what you need, and then you encounter a phenomenon that doesn't exist in your language, and you go, oh my God, I couldn't have possibly imagined that it is possible to do so. I think it applies to acting. They can't quite predict what they need because they don't quite know what is coming, what they're learning, and what other students will bring to the table. So agency is a wonderful thing, but in this way, I'm also siding a little bit with Conrad and perhaps with Sonia. we know certain things, and we can predict the trajectory sometimes, and students have no idea what's going to happen and what kind of learning will happen. So there's this negotiation between being an ignoramus, but also being an expert.
Can't hear you. Conrad, we can't hear you. Oh, yeah.
I just unmuted. Yeah, I unmuted. I just Googled Jean Twenge, who wrote this book called iGen, about the effect of smartphones on a whole generation of young people all over the world. And I came up with this Google search. There's an Atlantic article, Have Smartphones Destroyed a Generation? So yeah, in my classes, I talk about the fact that this is an incredibly potent and useful tool, but like every other tool humans have invented, every other system we've invented, like the use of fossil fuels, it cuts all kinds of different ways. So I talk about the fact that in performance, everything we're trying to teach students is being undermined by the kind of psychic construction that is operational with these devices, that they end up in purely in an imaginary place where they're disembodied, they're disconnected from each other. And so I tell them that right up on the very first day, this is my position, where I'm coming from. And I also frame the stuff that I'm teaching. I talk about the fact that, for example, the whole idea of performing the non-human is something that I'm really, really passionate about right now. One of the chapters that I'm developing is about that. And I use, I think the Lecoq pedagogy is incredibly powerful and wonderful, and you can play anything with Lecoq. But the whole focus of Lecoq's training was in performing humans that are like flamingos or hippos or bears or chickens. I mean, we play all kinds of animals using the neutral mask. And so my issue is with the students is, how can we play the non-human using the mask, right? I try to be sensitive to because my whole 5 terms worth of activity is headed towards them creating their own work collectively. We end up in a situation where you have 10 actors making a work together with no director, which of course is an astonishing accomplishment. And a number of times they do these hilarious send-ups of the classics that they're doing in their other classes. One of the most brilliant things I ever saw was a couple of years ago, this hilarious physical theater treatment of Nina's speech in The Seagull. So I'm giving them, I ask them I invite them to consider that the journey that we're on is about them becoming authors of their own work. So whatever tools we're acquiring along the way are all about them doing that, because in no other performance class do they get to do this. Actually, not quite true. In voice, they also do, they'll do monologues that are totally based on their experience. Yeah, I really feel like, unless I'm going to leave the room and let them train themselves, I have to, that's what I'm there to do. And I have absolutely no, I question everything that I do, but that I don't question, or else I don't have any reason to be in the room.
I had a conversation. Oh, sorry.
I'm just going to have you hold it, just because I want to mark that we are at our time, basically. So what I would like to invite is actually just to do one go around and let everybody kind of just, say whatever last thought, new direction. If you don't know which, I would invite maybe what do you see for moving forward for yourself? What do you hope? What do you want to take on next? But honestly, anything you'd like to respond to. Time has been very short on us. But Sonia, if you'd like to start, and then we'll kind of just loop through everybody and wrap up. Thank you.
Okay, I'll probably come up with something else that I wish I had said afterwards, but this is just what I was just going to comment on that. I'm part of another Zoom pedagogy group with instructors who either are at the Del Arte International School of Physical Theater in California, or are graduates of that program, alumni, and are teaching elsewhere. And so we've been meeting through the past couple of months in order to discuss ostensibly how can you teach mask online when you can't give them the mask, all of that. But that's what it was about. But the last month, what came up was this issue around being an expert and the push that can be felt to give that up. I am not the expert anymore. And exactly what we're talking about here. And I, similar to Conrad, really resisted that, feeling slightly guilty as I resisted it. But I said, you know, I've spent 30 years honing in on specializations that are of interest to me. If I don't know something by now that those students don't know, then I've wasted my entire life, and I am not going to give it up, right? I'm not going to throw it away. It is valuable. I hope it's of value. So how do you balance those two of being an expert in the room and yet also not being the dictator in the room or the be all and the end all? And when I studied with Lecoq, you know, and he was still alive when I was there. He was in his 70s in his last couple of years of teaching. And he was really clear. Like he was a French master. He was a frickin' dictator. But he was really clear on it. I didn't have a problem with that. It's just what it was in those walls. It was kind of like how my parents brought me up. Again, not necessarily parenting skills that I'm saying or are promoting, but that in my house, this is how you do it. Well, that was Lecoq's belief as well. And yet anybody who believes that is what he then wanted to create as actors, performers, theater makers is wrong, missed the point of what the next step was. But it was very much, in this school, I will teach you what blue is. You know, like I really got this point when we did colors, and I also didn't speak French when I was there, and they refused to speak English. So I was wrong all the time. But you know, where we did blue and there would be no instruction. And this comes down to also, I think, a misconception that a lot of North Americans seem to have about the via negativa that Gaulier, for instance, is trashed for. And I think it's a complete misconception that it is not about slamming the student. It is about actually like I always think of it as a sculpture. You know, I read a book about a sculptor, and he described how you chip away at this block of marble in order to reveal what is. You remove what isn't in order to reveal what is, and what is becomes what is left. And that to me is what I experienced in years of studying at Lecoq and then at Gaulier, that nope, c'est pas bon, c'est pas ça, c'est fou, so, no. It's just like it's a chip, until it is revealed what is. As opposed, it's not a big negative, nasty thing. But so he would not teach us, he would not tell us what he wanted. We learned by being told to do and having to go into the void, having to go into the lost space that Steve and I really loved that quote about, I am lost, we are lost, but I have been lost before. And we would have to be willing to get up and go, here's my blue, because you would go, you know, blue, on y va. And you go, this is blue. And he'd go, no. And part of me wants to go, excuse me, but that's my blue. So you can't tell me that is not blue. But the reality is that in the walls of Lecoq, absolutely, he can tell you that is not blue, because I'm paying him money for him to teach me what his blue is. From here, it's 50 years of experience of investigating, deeply, intricately investigating what is blue. Then though, he wants me, I love the look on Sarah's face, then he very definitely wants me to leave Lecoq and take his understanding of what blue is and make my own decisions about what blue is going to be in my work. It's so important, and that has always stuck with me. And that is what I bring to my teaching. I really hope I do know what blue is from my experience of 30 years of investigating it. Whatever blue, you know, like mask, whatever it is, acting. And I'm going to teach that because that's what I know how to navigate through, because I deeply believe it and understand it and see it and feel it and can teach it. And then I'm going to say, okay, and so now what? What do you have as that next generation to bring to that? What do you have to teach me? But I'm being paid to teach what I've spent my lifetime learning first. So I do agree with you, Conrad. And I think that it's a shame to have it viewed as a very sort of dictatorial approach. It doesn't need to be that at all. And I go into a great place of, I don't know. Here's what I do know. And I always admit what I don't know. I don't have a clue over here. And I don't know how it resonates with you. Tell me, show me the next thing. So I think it's about holding those two. Next.
Oh my God, it's bring back memories what you just described to me. I was in Philippe Gollier's class, we were doing spiders, and there were people from all over the world there. There were like 7 languages spoken in the room. There was this guy from Israel, Yuval Dohar, remember his name. And after his spider, Philippe said, your spider was a bit gay. I mean, he would get the whole class to, whenever he thought that you had done badly, he would get the whole class to assist him in mocking your work. And of course it was, we all laughed with him at ourselves. But I realized very quickly when I began teaching that work at UVic that, there's no possible way. I mean, I'd be, that's harassment, right? So the issue of blue, I can't even tell you, this resonates with me because I began to discover the students, I would check in with them. What do you think? Is that blue? Does that make sense? I had to abandon the whole idea of trying to find an essential meaning of a color just in the context of revising this pedagogical practice for a university system where the whole point of the activity is to get the students to find their own voice, to find their own way, to, especially because, as I say, they're not being given that chance to do that in their voice training and their acting training, where they're trying to be, they're up against this whole typology of characters. They're trying to fit themselves into that. Anyway, I just wanted to respond to that, Sonia, because I mean, you've had way more of this training than I have. You got to work with Jacques himself, but I understand that whole struggle that about who is the master. Like, I'm the master, you're the student. That simply does not apply at a university environment, or rather, well, you have to examine it in great detail to figure out what you can take from it that is still useful in a situation where you're essentially, you're helping the students to be, to exercise their democratic right. I mean, to be good citizens. I mean, that's maybe the most important thing they'll learn from this training, this education, right? We were supposed to sum up. You could see how we could just talk all day. We really need to, a bunch of us, like at UBC, some other people, I've been talking to people in my department, we wanted to establish a sort of national group of instructors who can talk about how to teach online. I mean, Sonia, what you're having to do is we got permission from the university to go to do face-to-face teaching in the fall with very strict guidelines in place, but we have to have also a plan where we can switch to online teaching like that quickly. So we have to, and so I'm talking about mask work, viewpoints. It's kind of nuts, but we have to rescue, we have to salvage something. So I would really like if we could go on as a group and get other people. There's a lot of other instructors all across this country that I know would be really interested in having some kind of, group. I don't do Facebook. I got off Facebook a couple of years ago because I just got fed up with it. But can we have some kind of instructor roundtable that's ongoing, that is particularly about all the issues that we're talking about, and that includes how we can somehow teach what we teach online?
Just wanted to say I would love that, Conrad. I would be thrilled to be part of that.
I can sum up for me. I don't know what blue is. The thing that I took from the Lecoq-Gollier training, and I did a short stint with Gollier, was, but I think it's applicable, is play, and play as relation, and play as a way of being in the world, and the importance of that. And I think there's something that this moment really calls upon, that I think that the failures, and I also did a half semester, not a month online, and it was pretty disastrous. And that to view this as if we're just doing adaptation of what we normally do, I think is a big mistake, that this is a whole new form we're involved in here. And I think that's why I think the teaching for me has got to be being very nimble, and the idea of emergence rather than a training is trying to together be artists. And I think for me as a deviser, it's about following the rising phenomena, the kind of mystery that occurs. And I think that's with students as well. And hopefully all of us students as well are able to respond to this very complex and more growing complex world that we're in. And this moment, it's a big challenge, but I think it's also got some real potential in it for us to think of it's an absolutely new form. And I think it's a real mistake, and I keep seeing it, where we're looking at the theater as a product that we just have to get out to the consumer, and we throw away what it is to participate in assembly, etc. And we just need to get it out to the online. So I think, and I've seen little bits of it with my students, of them responding with their knowledge of the tools that are making kind of interesting forms. I'm a bit tired of sitting in front of the computer, but I think that it's also a really possibly exciting moment. But I'm stumped also. I'm trying to figure it out as to how to go forward. And I appreciate this a lot. Thank you very much for organizing it, Art and Shelley. It is, as you said, Shelley, it's such a lonely practice being in the studio with students. Well, yeah, you know what I mean.
I guess I can go next. Oh, sorry, Trisha.
That's
I
okay,
just want to dovetail maybe on Stephen's, and I'll already say my concluding, which is indeed, I love this idea of emergence. And I think, I know for me also, as we're saying, to pool, Conrad, thank you, also to keep pooling resources as we're moving to remote work. And I think also to keep in mind to pull also from theater artists who are doing that. I know for my case, I've decided to move ahead with a production of Antigone here in the fall, when everything will be remote, and it's going to be a Zoom experiment with the students to cast via Zoom and rehearse via Zoom and create some sort of production via Zoom. And a big part of why I believe in that is because that's what theater artists around the world are struggling with. And I think part of imparting to the students what the value of art practice is to say, art practitioners are moving forward, and the form has always been evolving, and we're trying to see how we do what we do. And indeed, I think, Steve, for me too, it has to be the aesthetic of the squares and what's happening on the sides of the squares. And, and again, a lot of things I've seen so far in theaters via Zoom performances, still they're not working because they're just trying, it's like the very early theater on film experiments that just didn't work. The acting is too loud, too big, the scale doesn't work, and how we actually can do this, and in a way that still interestingly doesn't become only film. Right. So I think that's an interesting, for me, one of those interesting questions moving ahead, and indeed trying to think again of productively, as best as possible, how do we keep making space for art making, even as kind of tying back, Sonia, to what you mentioned, right? This incredible time of instability that many of our students might be feeling even more so because of where they're placed and in their lives, and how we can kind of still use our skills and our knowledges as a way to make a space where we can meet and we can make work together and think work together. That's not just a blip, right? Because I think, again, this blip is going to be not only longer than many of us would like it to be, but it's going to have repercussions. We're not going to go back to something pre-blip that's going to look the same. So I think that's a really significant possibility, that it's great that we're pooling together, both as teachers and also across the artistic community, to look at what is being done and how it's being done. Trisha.
Oh, thank you, Shelley. Yes, I think that COVID has actually placed us in a new era, a new epoch. And as I mentioned earlier, the birds ate our breadcrumbs. There is no way back at this moment. And so the only way is forward, which is very scary for me because I like having control. I like to know what's going to happen next, even though my students would probably disagree. But I do think that, you know, although we espouse the centrality of live performance, lots of performance has not been live, or the majority of the performances have not been live in theater, or whatever discipline we want to call it, for decades now. And many theater artists, Rimini Protocol, for example, they work from different countries, and most of the work is done online. So I think that this will provide us with a unique opportunity and a way to catch up with the students, because I think that their knowledge of technology is far greater than mine, and I really look forward to looking, you know, to them for a source of inspiration. But also what I wanted to add is that for me, when you're asking what are our hopes or what are our plans for the future, for me, I often doubt myself as a teacher, as a theater artist, and oftentimes I do retreat. I do try to move back. So I'll just give a very brief example. Last fall, I was teaching an entire class on viewpoints, and one of the other faculty who was teaching viewpoints like in a week-long sort of workshop, he said to me, "Oh my God, Trish, you're not planning on teaching viewpoints for the entire term, are you?" And I thought, "Oh, am I? Oh my God, what am I thinking?" And my colleague, he was thinking, how will you ever come up with enough material to cover the entire term? I was thinking the opposite. How am I going to pick and choose what to teach so that they will find it very valuable? And knowing going into the process that it certainly was not something that most of the students would have been interested in learning, because they love, for the most part, traditional work. They love doing scene study. The more familiar, oftentimes, initially, the better. But it was very important to me many, many times during the first weeks of the course. I thought, this isn't working. Oh my God, oh my God. I could retreat. I could be teaching something that wasn't quite viewpointy. They wouldn't know the difference. But you know, it was very difficult for me to stick to my guns and say, no, we aren't going back. We aren't going to do that. We're moving forward. And it really paid off in the end, that even though many of the students, you know, would laugh at viewpoints techniques, but they actually did really incredible work. And I have to say the work that they did was work that was initially guided by me, but by the end of the term, I was just basically the guide on the side. I was not the expert. And so I encourage everybody to move forward and to have faith in, you know, in yourselves. That's what I'm hoping will happen to me.
Sarah or Art, last thoughts before we close.
Sarah, do you want to speak?
Sure, thank you. Not quite sure what to say. It had been my feeling before COVID that our discipline was facing a crisis of relevancy anyway. And as I'm sitting here looking at the little squares on my screen, I have to acknowledge that we represent a very privileged group. And I think that also reflects most faculties in these departments across Canada. And I think if we're going to have meaningful evolution of our discipline moving forward, it's going to have to come with consultation of historically minoritized peoples that are not represented in this conversation today. And that's the end of my current thought.
Yes, I agree. I agree with that. I would say maybe not consultations, but actually giving them power. And I don't consider myself privileged being an immigrant, a non-native English speaker, coming from a poor economic background, and still very much struggling. So I'm very much familiar with the many of the struggles, but I do have a lot of privileges being a man and cisgender and many other things. So I recognize that too. But I think my concern after this conversation is that we don't quite speak the same language as instructors because we come from different schools of acting. And I think if we bring in people coming from other languages, cultures, trainings, it's going to become even more difficult for us to speak. So while that was mentioned to me by Daniel Mraz from the University of Ottawa, whose training is Eastern practices, and I understand that it might have been very difficult to express yourself if your training is rooted in yoga, in Kalaripayat, and then you are surrounded by graduates from the Lecoq School, or if you were trained in Russia by the followers of Stanislavski, North American method, which is extremely physical actually, and then you're surrounded by those who are trained in viewpoints, or vice versa. So I would love to have this national group. So I thank you for this idea of creating like a conversation circle maybe. So I think we should definitely go through that. But my biggest concern, and I think something we need to all consider, how are we going to talk? How are we going to speak the same language? Because even in this group, it was clear to me that we really can't, when it gets to the practical advice, you know what I mean? When we talk about practical pedagogy in the classroom, I might be over exaggerating it because again, I don't come from the Lecoq-Gaulier background, but I often feel completely lost when those things are mentioned because I was trained without masks and puppetry at all. So I was thinking of inviting Diane Roberts, who works in Montreal, and she's this amazing Afro-centered trainer. But I do know that her training comes from what she calls the village, and can we speak her language? Can you know? So that these are concerns that I have. How do we organize those discussions in the future? But on the other hand, I'm very, very grateful that we had this discussion already, and I think it's a starting point, and hopefully it will flourish and continue. So I'm very, very thankful to Shelley for jumping on board and coordinating this, and but also to everyone else for your input. I've learned a ton today, so thank you.
Thank you, everyone, again, and thank you for being generous with your time and with your perspectives with each other. And again, I look forward to, again, continuing this conversation via, everybody now has joint emails. Sarah, you mentioned there's this wonderful resource you could share with us. And again, I also mentioned in the chat to check out ATHA conference next week is having a workshop on Black acting pedagogy. Again, that's open to all if you register through ATHA. And lots of other resources. And again, I think I would really welcome continuing to share resources in this way and continue this conversation. So thank you all, and stay safe. And again, this will be up in a couple of weeks' time on the CATR SQET asynchronous conference. So I hope we'll all be kind of tuning into that as well.
Thank you, Shelley and Art, for organizing this.
Take care, everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Shelley.